So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay. And actually, I didn't think I was going to be able to record anything today, so this is a bit of a bonus to try and keep on top of my schedule. And it is also worth saying that probably the next battle that comes after this one may be a Minas Tirith siege, because I have been sent a couple of replays actually on Minas Tirith, and there is a way to sort of manually get that map to work again apparently. So that should be good. But you do need like a whole day free really if I'm going to be recording a siege on Minas Tirith, because they do tend to be incredibly long. But the grand return should be happening in the video after this one if all goes well. This one, however, was a new map that was added for 0.97, and this is called HARADWAITH. I think I got sent a couple of replays on this battle actually. Recently there was actually quite a large influx of replays, so it's kind of hard to keep track, to be honest with you, but regardless, I am going to be doing this one. And this one also is good versus evil, which is always nice. So we're going to be seeing good on the de facto defense today, because there are only two of them, and they also have this sort of rather nice small settlement and keep that they're going to be able to sort of rally around to try and defend against the three armies of evil that are going to be bearing down upon them. Speaking of which, let's go through the evil armies right now. And technically, as this is HARADWAITH, they're technically fighting on home turf, but it seems as though the invaders have managed to get themselves nice and comfortable in a settlement already before they've had time to respond. We have Clem, who's playing as Mordor, so we've got some Blackguard or Barad-dûr, which when you're on the attack, whether it's in sort of a more traditional siege or in a siege that's maybe a little bit more open plan like this one, a great shield infantry unit is always going to be a good thing. I'd argue actually it's even more useful in a siege battle with a little bit more room to manoeuvre, because it's less likely that the defenders are going to be able to just bulk up and stop the mass push with effectively a counter push of their own. It's much less likely to happen if there are plenty of places that you can try and apply pressure to. Back here, combination of Temple Executioners and Nazgul without the armour upgrade to Temple Executioners, but still, both of these two units represent a real problem if you're up against Mordor, because if you allow them to get settled in and amongst the lower tier infantry from Mordor, they can be quite difficult to isolate, and of course that means they're much more difficult to kill, especially in the Nazgul's case. Like, there may only be 10 of them, but over a long period of time they can do an awful lot of damage if you're not careful, and you've got to try and deal with them in some way rather than just throwing men against them, because they will inflate their kill count if you do that. Orc Javelins, always a safe pick, no matter what kind of battlefield you're playing on as Mordor, because they're so cheap and they're capable of dishing out a decent amount of damage. Rhûn Archers, kind of the same thing. Like, you know, their additional armour does help them in comparison to the Orc Archers. You're never going to be winning much in the way of a quality fight at long range as Mordor. They do have some high quality archers, but they're not really designed to be in a skirmish fight in the way the Rhûn Archers are. Still, numbers are always going to be Mordor's focus when it comes to a fight of attrition. Sauron's Will and more Blackguard or Barad-dûr. So Sauron's Will are always a good choice as well, because they do offer a genuine damage spike in and amongst some of the more rank and file Mordor troops, which is lacking. I mean, there are the Orc Maulers, which do offer it at a little bit of a cheaper price, but of course they do tend to die in droves in ways that the Sauron's Will won't. So it is a choice that needs to be made. Olaghai, obviously, you know, again, some of the strongest trolls in the game, if not the strongest. We've seen trolls used quite well recently, actually, but they are still a very high-risk, high-reward kind of proposition. They can get kills very, very quickly on the right kinds of units, but also because of their low unit count, if they do get isolated against high-damage infantry, they can find themselves getting felled pretty quickly. And of course, the same applies if they're out in the open and they get charged by a unit of decent cavalry. That's unlikely to be too much of a problem, however, because we can see there are Melkor's Chosen here, which are undoubtedly going to be running a bit of interference on any defending cavalry that tries to sally out and attack the attacking armies before they reach the defences. When there are Melkor's Chosen about, that's going to be much, much more difficult, because if you're getting caught in melee with any of your cavalry with the Melkor's Chosen, chances are they're going to die very, very fast. Orc Fodder as well, obviously you may as well bring them, they're free. Anti-cavalry at the very least, although the bonus is very small and they'll still die to a charge. Rhûn Infantry over here, again, the rank and file of Mordor offers a little bit in terms of numbers, and a second unit of fodder, so Clem actually has stumped up to pay a little bit for another unit of fodder. Probably run out of money because of all the quality that army has elsewhere. Hunter 15 is going to be playing as Rhûn, so a little bit more quality in the main line. Obviously Rhûn are a much more balanced faction, I mean balanced in terms of their focus between attack and defence, not in terms of their game balance. But yeah, Rhûn are well known as a bit of a jack of all trades. Rim, again, I guess I've never been a huge fan of the Rim, just because they do tend to be less efficient than the Variag mercenaries in most situations, but actually considering one of the opponents that is on the defence today, I actually think the Rim are probably the slightly better choice here. Because I do think the additional focus on offense is actually going to be quite useful. Having said that, I'm still glad to see that the Variag mercenaries are here, because of course one thing that the evil factions can do pretty much universally is engage in a skirmish fight and have a good amount of success doing so. A few exceptions to that, Angmar and the Misty Mountains most notably, but a lot of the evil men are quite comfortable in engaging in a long skirmish battle. 2 units of Innis Rim by the looks of things, which is an interesting choice, to be honest with you. It'll be interesting to see if these sort of heavy Lancer Cataphract type units are going to be able to be used effectively, because they do have a decent charge. They're decently armoured and shielded as well, so basic arrows will take a little while before they start to have the impact that players may want. But if the defenders are able to sort of cover their corners, cover their front lines, and make sure there are no gaps, then a unit like the Innis Rim is going to have much less of a chance to be super effective, but we'll see. Lancers like that will actually be much better in the hotfix. Of course, they will be made. Their morale will be slightly improved. I think the Innis Rim are counted among that. Not sure. Gamperim anyway. Phalanx unit, Halberdier, very, very nice to have on the front line as long as you keep them back long enough for arrows to not be too much of a problem. Interesting to see these lads as well. Eastron warriors with the armour upgrade as well. It will mitigate their weakness to arrows a little bit, but that is still going to be their primary problem. However, in melee, for a unit of their cost, they're actually pretty damn good, especially when it comes to their melee defense. Combine that with the armor upgrade, and they're significantly better than even the Clansmen are actually in melee, which, considering the Clansmen are spoken of so highly as a militia sort of sword and board unit, it's no faint praise. But of course, the problem with the Eastron Warriors often is that they're quite difficult to use like that, because they represent such an easy unit to kill with arrows that they're always going to be shot long before they become too much of a problem in melee. So we'll see if that's the case here. Eastron crossbows, again, crossbows always going to be useful in a situation like this because of their stopping power, albeit the runic ones are quite vulnerable to arrows as well. Flagrim, AP, quality line infantry, always good to see them. And again, a good choice because one of the factions that's on the defence most certainly does rely a little bit on their armour, so the Flagrim will be very much at home in fighting them. And of course some Scion Rim as well, some heavy spears, very reliable heavy spearmen at that as well. Not necessarily the best at dealing damage, but Rhûn have got plenty of other options to deal damage. It's nice to have a solid centre to your army. And then finally, we do have the Orcs of the Misty Mountains played by Clatati, so we've got some Goblin Archers here on the front line, as well as some heavy Goblin Archers as well. So if the Misty Mountains are going to go for a skirmish heavy approach, they need to go for quantity rather than quality. They do have crossbowmen that they can bring, and I'm sure as we look further back in the army we will see the crossbows. But these archers, like I say, if you're on the attack in a sort of siege-like situation like this, then it always pays to bring at least 1 or 2 units of archers, even if you're a faction that doesn't necessarily have the best, like the Misty Mountains, because you always want to put pressure on the smaller armies on the field, which the Misty Mountains can certainly do here. Troll Drummers, Cave Troll Drummers, a very important part of the Misty Mountains, more so the drummers for the Misty Mountains than Mordor, because while Mordor do have morale issues, they at least have a more well-rounded roster than the Misty Mountains. The Misty Mountains are most certainly the most quantity-heavy army in the game, and of course with that comes some pretty serious morale issues with their lower-tier units, more so than any other faction in the game. The Drummers, however, can circumvent this to a large degree. They can make it so that your morale is buffed significantly enough that they'll keep fighting for a lot longer than they otherwise would, which is very important for Misty Mountains, and of course in the hotfix they'll be able to bring 2 before the cost increases, so a very useful little thing for them to have. Here are the crossbows, again useful for the same reasons as the runic ones, though I think the Misty Mountains ones might actually be slightly better because I think their armour values are slightly higher. Not quite as good as the Isengard version, but still it's much the same sort of thing here as it would be for Isengard, or indeed Rhûn, to be honest. Mountain Uruk Coast, again, pleased to see them because of course this is pre-hotfix, so the heavy Goblin Infantry have not had their price reduction in this universe just yet, which will make them a much more viable option. At the moment though, there's really no reason to bring them. You're always going to bring the Mountain Uruk Coast, because while they may be more expensive, they're worth every penny of that and more. They are a very efficient line infantry unit. They will struggle a little bit in terms of quality against really high-end troops, but much in the same way as the Uruk-hai infantry do, they mean that enemy armies won't be able to skimp on quality on the front line. Otherwise they'll find the Misty Mountains taking more chunks out of them than they would expect. White Uruk Fearmongers are always a good thing to have in the front line as well. I've referred to them in the past as Ghetto Fountain Guard because they do kind of give off that vibe. They're not as impressive as the Fountain Guard by any means, but they do still do a lot of damage, armour-piercing damage at that, and obviously in and amongst the Misty Mountains troops they are certainly a high-tier option. Goblin King's Bodyguard is much the same sort of thing. Again, in the hotfix they've had their numbers increased a little bit, which suits the Misty Mountains a lot and will make them a lot better as well. At the moment they're just a very run-of-the-mill bodyguard unit. But in the hotfix they'll be made a little bit more special. Obviously their stats in comparison to other sword and board bodyguard units are not exceptional, but with the additional manpower in them that will make a big difference, a very big difference actually. And another unit to obviously benefit from the hotfix will be the Black Orcs of the Mountains, but heavy swordsmen for the Misty Mountains will still be useful in this situation, again as long as they avoid the arrow fire. And a cheap unit of Goblin Infantry at the back, or free unit of Goblin Infantry at the back actually, which is where the General's going to be hanging out, so they're going to obviously stay back until the very end. Now moving on to the defenders. The first defending army, we have my dude, who's going to be playing as Linden. Interesting to see Linden once again. Like I said, they seem to be the least popular elven faction in the current patch, although the hotfix will buff them a little bit in general. Obviously the Noldorin Blade Masters will be made locked morale at last, which will be obviously what they should have been from the start, but also the buff to the Mithlond Marines will certainly help them out a little bit, give them a unit that's more similar to the Seafarers of Nindamos from Númenor. Warns of Elos Tyrion though, Rangers of course, Rangers. It will be interesting to see how they're used in this battle, because while it is a nice defensive position, I'm not sure whether they have the elevation to really shoot into a blob, but we'll soon find out, I'm sure. Speaking of the Mithlond Marines, this is obviously pre-hotfix version of them, so they're not quite as impressive as they will be, but still nice to bear in mind. Harland and Guard, the slightly higher tier unit of Linden archers, a shield value and higher damage, and also spears in case any cavalry should try and charge into them. But of course the main event is obviously going to be those elven arrows. 4 Linden archers, obviously the lower end variant without any of the bells and whistles the Harland and Guard have. Mithlond pikes, Mithlond swordmasters, definitely a higher tier Linden army, and that's what you would expect considering the numbers discrepancy between the two sides today. Noldorin Guard on the front line are always going to be a really nice unit of line infantry to have as well, buffing nearby troops, as well as being very, very effective fighters in their own right. Mithlond Swordmasters, Harland infantry, obviously in the pre-hotfix world that we live in for this battle, the Harland infantry are probably more efficient in 9 situations out of 10 over the Mithlond Swordmasters that they'll be fighting alongside. That won't be the case after the hotfix, because of course shock infantry will be made a little bit more usable, shall we say. Noldorin Blade Master here again, like I said, not locked morale, so that could be a problem actually in this battle if things wear on and things get really close. If their morale starts to falter towards the end against something like the Nazgul, that could be devastating. And of course, Horse Lords of Ulmo. In terms of using knights aggressively with their lances and being really quick, the Horse Lords of Ulmo are very, very dangerous. But again, they are more lightly armoured than other units of knights, and of course they don't have a shield value as such either. Which means they do lack a little bit in terms of overall survivability, especially compared to something like the Gwythi Rockdor from their cousins over in Imladris. But now, for the final army, we have the player who sent me the battle replay. It's another one from Hrothgar Heavenlight as well, so big thank you to him. He sent me quite a lot recently actually, which I'm certainly very thankful for. He's going to be playing as Cardolan, so pretty much the opposite to Linden in a few ways. Obviously they're much more, they pack on a lot more armour at the very least than Linden. And unlike Linden, whose morale is pretty solid for the most part, other than the Noldorin Blade Masters, because they're not locked morale. Their morale is still very high, of course, it's just not locked, but you know, it's still not as high as it should be. Cardolan, of course, very well documented for having morale issues, but there are many ways that you can get around that, and of course use their support units, which are very impressive. Minhiriath archers, very comfortable in a skirmish fight, as they will need to be, because I think that's going to be one of the attacker's best tools if they use it to good effect in this battle. They could try and wear the defenders down. Minhiriath spearmen, which again, line spears, just sort of basic spearmen. They are AP, but it's only to a very small extent. Certainly not enough to make a big difference, but it does give them a little bit of extra bite where maybe you wouldn't expect it. A unit with an awful lot of bite is going to be the Tharbad Warhammers, some much needed quality in armour piercing on the defence, it must be said, because they can't just be reliant on Linden's javelins alone to do the business. They're going to need some in melee as well, and the Tharbad Warhammers most certainly provide that. All of the attacking armies will want to be very careful falling under the blows of those hammers. Greenway Garrison footmen in large quantities. Again, this is something Cardolan can most certainly do. Field a lot of cheap pikes, which when you're on the defence like this, as long as you can cover them from any arrow fire, are a good choice for me. Minotaur Roman Gatekeeper, so again, crossbows, upgraded as well, armour upgraded makes them very, very tanky, so enemy archers are not really going to be able to touch them. They're decent in melee as well. Crossbows are a must bring for Cardolan. Like, as much as I have my issues with crossbows in the way the game currently is, for Cardolan, they are pretty reliant on them and they do need them to an extent. Gwathlo trackers, again basic archers, not particularly great in a skirmish fight, but they can hide, so it means they can avoid a skirmish fight entirely if they really want to. Warns of Tir Gorthad, probably the best way Cardolan has to buff the morale of its front line, and undoubtedly that's what Hrothgar will want to use them for. Dunedain captains as well, who don't have the armour upgrade by the looks of things. They've got their Cardolan tabards though, wearing them proudly. Another unit of heavy swordsmen, obviously nowhere near as strong as the Noldorin Blade Masters. They'll be fighting alongside, and indeed I believe they're being tweaked to be a little bit more like the dismounted Knights of the Silver Swan for Dol Amroth, where they're not going to be as impressive as other bodyguard swordsmen, but you will be able to bring 2 of them in the hotfix, I believe. I think that's the idea anyway. But But yeah, we'll see about that. It's an interesting idea, and I do kind of agree with it, because certainly next to the other bodyguard heavy swordsmen, the Dunedain captains are a little bit... I mean, they're still very good, but they're not as good. So maybe sort of slightly decreasing their stats as it stands and allowing you to bring 2 of them could be the way forward. Minhiria Spearmen once again, mercenary guildsmen. Obviously mercenaries have always had morale issues by design, doubly so for Cardolan, but it is a unit of armour-piercing line infantry, which will be useful once again. Some maces on the front line. Men-at-arms as well. Obviously they're not armour-piercing like the mercenaries, but they're a little bit better all round in terms of their stats. Then back here we have the Hearthguard and the Trebuchet. Trebuchet could be really useful. The Hearthguard, they don't do a lot of damage, but they are at least a very nice core to have for the Cardolan army, because they buff morale. Don't do a lot of damage, but they are difficult to kill at the very least, so if it does come down to it in the late game, maybe they will be the difference between victory and defeat. But without further ado, let's begin. So it'll be interesting to see who makes the first move here. I think probably there's going to be a little bit of a grace period, because I think Cardolan and Linden will be allowed to move in. I mean, if there is no grace period, then one thing that the attacker should absolutely try and do is move forward as quickly as they are physically able, and I think that's actually what Rhûn may be looking to do. I mean, this honestly is probably the best chance Rhûn is going to get to utilise their Inas Rim effectively while the armies are transitioning from the outer areas to within the settlement they're undoubtedly going to want to occupy for the vast majority of this fight. As the drums continue, the Melkor's chosen as well. I mean, I think there is a bit of a grace period going on here, which, I mean, fair enough. It's fair play, considering that it's always going to be quite difficult, I think, for the army of 2 against the army of 3 in this situation, especially if they get jumped on before they're able to really get set in a nice position. Just having a look at this little settlement though while this transitionary period's happening. It's a fairly large choke point over here actually, which I think is fertile grounds for an attack, to be honest with you. Mordor will probably come around here in their entirety. Maybe Rhûn can send a little bit of support as well. So I think certainly from the front over here is the least likely place for an assault. I mean, there is a nice hill over here potentially that the attackers could put some archers on and shoot down into a defensive line, which is maybe sticking out a little bit too far. But over here it's too narrow, I think. Far too narrow. I mean, if I were them, I would send Mordor and the lion's share of Rhûn's quality around the other side, and from the front over here I would just slowly drip feed in troops from the Misty Mountains, maybe backed up by a little bit of Rhûn's fodder as well. And if they start to falter over here because I've sent too much stuff over to the other side, then the Misty Mountains can come down on them like a ton of bricks. Because they will need to send quite a lot over here, I think, to defend the defenders, as long as there is, I suppose there is a narrow choke point here which is like a fence, but it's so open over here that the attackers could use their archers to pretty good effect, I think. But we'll see. The battle is most certainly still in its very early phases after all. Still, the attackers have not actually yet moved in. Interesting to see the Tharbad Warhammers come around the front over here. Again, a very important unit, I think, in this particular fight, because especially if it gets into the late game where the quality units that both sides have left will become really, really useful, to have a really high damage unit of armour-piercing shock infantry like the Tharbad Warhammers will work wonders against any remaining basic units from Mordor, Rhûn, or the Misty Mountains, to be honest with you. Rhûn are maybe the least reliant on armour of those 3, but it's still... armour is still a big part of what they do. It almost looks like you should be able to get back up here onto these hills, but this is unfortunately where the map ends. Probably a good thing actually for the defenders, because it would be fairly easy to circumvent a lot of these defences if not for the red line. Yeah, there is a hill, to be fair, which is bad news for the attackers, because it means the rangers do have a place to post up. You do need to be fairly careful, because they will be open to enemy archer fire coming from that direction where Cardolan are currently marching in. But they just need to bide their time. Rangers are always going to be exceptionally useful. Didn't see any rangers, interestingly enough, from Cardolan, even though they do have access to them. So Dunedain rangers, of course, nowhere to be seen. Gwathlo trackers, but they are, of course, not rangers. They are frauds. They may hide and wear light armour, but rangers they most certainly are not. It's looking like Mordor don't have rangers either, even though they can also bring a Dunedain Shadowbows. Like, rangers obviously skew the power balance in a siege enormously depending on who's able to utilise them most effectively, which often is the defenders, but if the attackers can use them, woe betide the defenders. There's actually some Carmel's Dragon Knights over here as well, which I completely missed, which is kind of a strange thing to completely miss. Obviously another unit of Lance Knights. I think Rhûn has gone too heavy for cavalry for me. just one unit of cav, and one unit of basic lancers, to be honest with you, is enough for me in this situation, if then you can utilise them. I mean, I suppose they can jump on the Horse Swords of Ulmo and completely overwhelm them and make Linden waste a bit of money, which maybe is more important, but you never know that in the army composition phase. And I'd be more than happy to leave the anti-cavalry stuff to the Orc factions in this situation. Their wargs are going to be far more effective than Rhûn's heavy cataphracts at hunting down cavalry. Although to be fair, you're going to need some fairly serious cavalry if you're going to deal with the Horse Swords of Ulmo. Fortunately for the attackers, the Melkors Chosen are such a unit. Horse Swords of Ulmo are definitely going to want to avoid the Melkors Chosen, but the best thing about the Horse Swords of Ulmo is the fact that if you don't want to take a fight, you can rather easily avoid it because of how fast the Horse Swords of Ulmo are. They do pay for this in terms of their armour values, of course. If you can start shooting them with arrow fire over a prolonged period of time, they will start to drop. But still, definitely something to be concerned about. It's going to be interesting to see what my dude over here does with this. I mean, if I were the Horse Swords of Ulmo, I would not charge into the front over here, because there are crossbows and all sorts that will be able to do the business against the Horse Swords. I'd send them around the back, to be honest with you. Walk them around the back, just take your time. I mean, this is going to be a bad fight for the NS Rim. Lance to lance. The initial charge will favour the Horse Swords of Ulmo, and then the fight in melee will as well. Now, coming in from the side here, the NS Rim coming in with a charge of their own, but that mostly hit their own unit. It won't deal friendly fire, at least, but it didn't connect with the Horse Swords of Ulmo at all well. As you can see here how quickly the NS Rim are dropping. They are lancers. They're not really designed to be in combat like this against knights, certainly not without support. If they had a unit of melee cavalry with them, perhaps the armour and defensive values would be useful. I mean, in come the trolls. To be honest with you, this is a pretty good opportunity here for my dude. If he can charge into Cletati's trolls there and kill off a few of those cave troll drummers. I mean, without the drummers, the Misty Mountains army is really going to struggle in melee, especially against Linden. Like, their morale will start to collapse pretty quickly, you'd imagine. They really need to push up their archers and the like to make sure they can continue. Linden Guard firing away. In come the Horse Swords of Ulmo once again, so the initial cavalry engagements are happening. I mean, the NS Rim are going to try and charge on through to the Linden Guard, but I mean, the Linden Guard won't mind this too much. They will still take damage off a charge, of course, against heavy cataphracts, but in melee, they are spearmen, so they're going to be more at home in this kind of engagement than they would otherwise be. But I mean, yeah, a decent pair of charges from the NS Rim, but they'd already taken so much damage at the hands of the Horse Lords that those charges didn't really carry the same weight as they otherwise would have. Which is a shame for Rhûn, because it does mean, unfortunately, that they are going to lose their NS Rim. But to be honest with you, like I said, the NS Rim, how useful were they really going to be in this fight? I think the bigger shame for the Runic player is the amount of money spent on those 2 units of NS Rim. That won't necessarily now be all that useful. To be fair, their morale held together better than I thought it would. So, obviously you expect a unit to break when they've taken that amount of damage. The Melkors Chosen are finally coming across now, which will finally give the Horse Swords of Ulmo cause to leave this area. Which honestly would be my time to sort of move around the lake now. Because like I said, they've already seen combat now, so they have already taken a little bit of damage of the Horse Swords, even if they haven't really taken any casualties. So if they were engaged by the Melkors Chosen, this would definitely be going in favour of the Mordor mounted unit. In comes the Trebuchet. Not sure I'd be using it this early, trying to go after the sort of clump of Eastron warriors. They don't really get too many kills though. Some damage to the Eastron warriors, a little bit of damage to Mountaineer at coast as well, not necessarily really telling kills. Again, the Trebuchet, when things blob up, Trebuchet could be just as useful, if not even more so, as the Rangers because of their ability to break units more quickly than Rangers. Rangers will rack up more kills, but in this sort of situation, the real damage could be done to morale. Especially when you're talking about going up against primarily Orc factions. The Misty Mountains especially, if you can get them away from their drummers. Mordor as well. Like, Mordor do have quite a few higher end units to be fair, so maybe morale is not going to be such an issue for them. Only the Morannon units and the fodder. But that also raises questions about whether they have the manpower to sort of maintain an assault against a well-prepared defence. We shall see. It looks as though he's going to have to go up against Cardolan primarily, which Mordor may not be too disappointed about. But it does mean that in all likelihood he's going to have to deal with some crossbow fire. To be fair though, only 1 unit of crossbows. No sharpshooters really. Just the 1 unit of Manatar Romen Gatekeepers. So 1 crossbow unit, 1 ranger unit. it could be far more horrifying for the attackers, if I'm being honest, in terms of composition, certainly. Over here, meanwhile, it does look as though the attackers, they want to utilise their skirmishes, which, to be fair, considering the compositions they brought, I certainly don't blame them for. But they are going to need to skirmish sooner rather than later, because the 4 Linden archers are already firing into them. And needless to say, Goblin archers are going to be no match for 4 Linden archers. You can make the argument that the Goblin archers are not really worth going after with any kind of archer, but you don't really have a choice. It's the beauty of having these really cheap archers. Like, you force your opponent to do something about them. Either they're going to waste resources or they're going to waste manpower. And in Linden's case, they're going to have to waste resources by the looks of things. 4 Linden archers. This isn't maybe the best position for a unit of archers, and to be honest with you, based on the defensive shape of Linden over here, as soon as some of these infantry units get a little bit closer to this gap, they should flood in. They will take damage, of course, a lot of damage, but this doesn't look too organised for me. Over here, meanwhile, on the periphery of the fight, as it stands, all sorts of Ulmo moving away. Carmel's Dragon Knights are actually chasing after them, which that's actually a fairly even fight. I mean, the Dragon Knights do still have 2 unit models more. They haven't been in combat yet, unlike the Horse Swords of Ulmo, but of the 2, like, the Dragon Knights are more durable overall. When it comes to melee, I think the melee defense of the Horse Swords of Ulmo, and of course the damage, would give the edge to the Linden Riders there. We'll see if those 2 should ever come into contact. Keep an eye on the mini-map for that. In come the Variag Mercenaries. This isn't an overly long fight, like 27,000 frames is kind of like the sweet spot. It's not too short for the video to be kind of a little bit, on the short side. But it's also not so long that I'm completely unable to do it on a day where I've just got back from university. Gwathlo trackers are over here ready, hiding, getting ready to engage in the inevitable skirmish fight that's going to happen over on this side of things as well. Forces of Evil getting ever closer. Variag Mercenaries and Goblin Archers combining their firepower. You can tell Linden doesn't want to use archers because more and more now we're seeing them pull back. They may not have too much of a choice here, and you can see Mercenary Guildsmen are now moving in. Goblin Infantry. I mean, Mercenary Guildsmen all on their lonesome may struggle for morale here if some more serious units get committed forward, but if it's just Goblin Infantry, the armor piercing's not too useful, but I mean, it's Goblin Infantry, it's a free unit of fodder. Any unit of dedicated line infantry is going to be able to emerge victorious from that. More is definitely going to be needed, but they have a decent concentration of archers and they're definitely trying to do the business here. And they're targeting the Linden troops as well, which is also the right thing to do. You really don't want to make it so in the late game you're left without ammunition and having to engage in pure melee with Linden, because the melee defense that Linden bring to the table is going to make that very difficult for you to do efficiently. So trying to kill as many of them with the arrows as you can and try and make it all about your numbers in the late game is definitely the right move here. But of course that would leave Cardolan largely untouched. The armour and shields of the Mercenary Guildsmen are better than Linden's troops, but I mean it's a little bit... Don't be fooled too much by their appearance. Like, their armour is decent, but it's not amazing. Goblin Archers continuing to fire in. Let's see if Mordor are inching forwards. They're still a little bit further back. You can see the Orc fodder moving forwards, but there has been a little bit of damage done. A little bit of hit and run on the Greenway garrison. Oh, that's a very interesting position for the Morannon Archers to get into. Raining death down upon the Cardolan defenders, and they don't really have too much of a choice here other than to sit here and take it. A lot of the arrows are being hit into the ground because of the position of the archers, but I mean, that's fine in this sort of situation. Like, you have a perfect opportunity here to shoot down from on high, use the high ground, and get some good kills on Cardolan as well. So good spot that from Mordor, because I probably would have missed that actually. I probably would have considered this impassable terrain after a certain point. Persistence pays off. Meanwhile, still archers. Oh, hello. Looking at the mini-map here, there has been an engagement between the two units of knights. The Horse Swords of Ulmo do charge in. The charge initially favoured them because it's even to 24 against 24, but I mean, there are deaths happening on both sides. I mean, this is what happens when two units of knights go head-on with one another, but like I said, I think the melee capabilities of the Linden riders will give them the edge, but the Linden general is actually the one that has charged all the way to the back over here, and he's being surrounded by the runic riders. And yeah, you can see the Carmel's Dragon Knights are losing this fight pretty handily. I'm pretty sure Hunter 15 is going to be... I mean, he has killed the Linden general at least. Hunter 15 is probably very confused about how he's thrown all of his cavalry at the Horse Swords of Ulmo and still hasn't been able to bring them down, but not a name I recognise, so perhaps a slightly newer player. Again, if you're going to go after the Horse Swords, he could have easily overwhelmed them if all three of the cav units happened all at once, but it's definitely a newer player move to send in weak units first and send in the strong units later in that manner. Meanwhile, here on the front line, what's going on here? Lots of arrows still being traded from both sides. Eastron Warriors on the front line. Damage been taken by them though. Of course, like I said, they're a real magnet for arrows because of how vulnerable they are to them. Even with the armour upgrade, they're really not going to be able to withstand too much of that. Mountaineer at Coast are here as well though. They will be a little bit more vulnerable to the armour piercing of the mercenaries that are on the front line. Goblin Archers just being thrown in as well. But the front line is being tested, and of course there's plenty more where that came from for the attackers. We'll see if the defenders will be so resilient as so far as their numbers goes. A lot of damage been done to this unit of Greenway Garrison Spearmen. This unit of Moran on Archers really filling their boots. Both units of Moran on Archers actually doing the same. This is a little bit less great, like more of the arrows are hitting the dirt over here. I'd probably just wait for one unit to finish off and then send in the other one as well. Sort of on a rotation. Again, hitting nicely. The Minhiriath Spearmen standing up to this sort of pressure much better. The downside to this, of course, is Mordor won't actually be able to skirmish with Cardolan because they're not going after any of Cardolan's archers over here, which means that they will be free to go after the Mordor infantry when Mordor decides to come forward. So it'll be interesting to see if that's actually worth it. In comes the Trebuchet fire now. A grazing hit onto the Black Uruks of the mountains there. Again, it's risky to actually shoot in here because now it's more defender than attacker. So you're actually at greater risk of friendly fire, even with the higher proportion of, well, even with the higher accuracy the Trebuchet now has. Variag mercenaries just in the background there. Again, both sides continuing to trade arrows. The Snaga are here as well on the front line. That's a good move. I like that from Clatati. Sending the javelins in close. I mean, it's clear that they've been focused down by archers, but javelins will be able to do a decent amount of damage while they're still there. Mythalon pikemen getting shot. I mean, this is the issue. Like, the Misty Mountains and Rhûn and Mordor, they are finding gaps in the defences here to be able to shoot at more vulnerable units. And I do think that that will stand them in pretty good stead as the battle goes on. But I mean, it's kind of hard to tell because obviously initially the defenders are really going to struggle here while the defenders are still at full force. Eastron Warriors there, shaken as a result of taking that direct hit from the Trebuchet. Doing their best on the front line, but they're going to need some support, otherwise they will rout, especially with some Minhiriath men-at-arms arriving on the front line to support. Mythalon Swordmasters coming in as well. 76 of them. Victory seems certain for the defenders. The Black Uruks have actually pushed through, or actually pushed the defenders back a little bit, along with the Mountaineer at Coast. Obviously two pretty decent units when they're working in tandem, but when it comes to pure melee, they're still going to suffer, especially at the hands of something like the Mythalon Swordmasters with their sheer damage. The problem I can see here is that Mordor are not really applying the same kind of pressure over here. I can understand why, because it's a fairly intimidating sight to see a pass like this with all of these defences, especially seeing as you've got the ability to sort of take your time with your skirmishers. But if your allies are moving in, you're kind of on a ticking clock. Because alone, your two allies, I don't think they will break through here. You need to sort of apply pressure from the other side as well, even if it means your army does get swallowed up and destroyed. It means that so many more resources have been sent over to try and stop you, and your allies should then be able to push through. I still think Rhûn should have sent over a little bit over there to help Mordor out, though. I think that would have been a little bit more optimal, because this is a very narrow pass they're going to have to try and get their way through here. And I'm not sure whether that is going to be happening. Victory is a distinct possibility. Victory is almost a certainty for the Minhiriath men-at-arms. They are shaken though, so it does go to show there's no morale boosting units for Cardolan nearby. Even in an engagement that's going reasonably well for them for the time being, their morale is still a little bit all over the place. And with more reinforcements coming in from more Mountaineer at Coast, they may very well break pretty quickly. I mean, they have taken a lot of losses as well, it's worth saying. 4 Linden archers coming in, out of ammunition, I would assume. Again, any elven archer is going to be decent in melee, but the 4 Linden archers aren't that special. It's just going to be more bodies for the front line, really. Slow the attackers down. Forward comes some Harland and infantry as well, ready to plug the gap that the Minheliath men-at-arms probably will leave behind. 64 of them remaining. Cave Troll Drummers close enough that the Misty Mountains will be receiving that buff. They will be a little bit more difficult to get rid of. And a unit of pikemen also coming forward from Cardolan. Will be very vulnerable to any arrow fire that the attackers want to pour in here. But if they can get their pikes down, they'll also make a decent line. Back go the Linden Swordmasters, trying to make it a little bit more difficult for them to get shot. Forward come Mordor from this side again. Clem needs to send forward some more quality than this. Like, if he sends forward just 2 units of orc fodder backed up by a unit of Rhûn archers, that's not going to do anything. Like I said, this is one of my pet peeves. People sending in these really low tier units first because they think they're worthless. I mean, you did pay either nothing or a very small amount of gold for these orc fodder, but you still need to make use of them. They're still a part of your army. This is not going to really do much of anything. This Cardolan front line is going to be able to withstand them. They are at their best when they are acting as a foil to a more quality unit. I can understand sending them in maybe to try and absorb a bit of ammunition, but they're not going to be in melee long enough. They're not going to stay alive long enough to absorb a significant amount of ammunition, is my problem with this. Rhûn archers much the same. Better armour at the very least, but no shield, so it kind of balances itself out. Men-at-arms coming forward to sort of fill the gaps that the archers did initially do in terms of their damage. And the Guathlo trackers will be able to fill their boots for kills as well. Another unit of Rhûn archers coming forward. Yeah, it's one of my pet hates, that, in the game. Sending forward fodder to just do nothing, accomplish nothing. The battle would be exactly the same if Clem had not sent in the fodder at that point, really. Over here, meanwhile, a much more genuine attempt, I think, from the attackers to force entry. And to be honest with you, if I were the attackers, I'd really take this. I mean, there's the opportunity to pour in here with numbers and mass. There goes the Runic General, skewered by the Horse Swords of Ulmo. So once again, sort of in the backfield over here. This could be a real problem, honestly. The Dragon Knights are still alive. I mean, to be fair, considering the charges that both units are getting into one another, the Horse Swords of Ulmo will still win, but they will be much depleted. But they're still going to be buzzing around here behind enemy lines, and they could do a decent amount of damage, to be honest with you. Definitely something that the attackers are going to have to deal with here. Because 16 Horse Swords of Ulmo is still a pretty dangerous proposition, to be honest with you. You definitely need to defend yourself a little bit better than this. I mean, the White Heroic Fearmongers are back here. The Scion Rim are not going to be able to catch the Horse Swords of Ulmo unless... Well, I mean, that was a bit of bait, to be honest with you. The Dragon Knights just came in here to try and hold the Horse Swords of Ulmo in place. I mean, you did the first bit very nicely, Rhûn, but then you need to spread your unit out and sort of envelop the Horse Swords, because as it is, the Horse Swords could just very easily run over there, and then all of that good work was for naught. And indeed, that is what they will do, because the Dragon Knights were finished off by that charge, and now the Horse Swords will very easily just... Well, actually, no, they weren't finished off. There's still 2 of them, but 1 or 2 kills for a good idea, maybe not executed the best. The second part of the plan wasn't executed as well as it could have been, certainly. Heavy Goblin Archers in behind enemy lines, getting some support from the Gamprim. And the Gamprim are also going to be taking javelins from the Mithlon Marines, but likewise from the Snaga skirmishes for the defenders, Noldorin Guard taking some unwanted armour-piercing damage, but the Gamprim immediately routing. They've taken a lot of damage immediately from javelins and from archers on the way into the settlement. There are the Warns of Elos Tyrion. Let's go and see how Mordor are getting along. Poorly, I would imagine, on this front line, and indeed it is. I'm actually amazed they're still fighting, to be honest with you, but yeah, a very comfortable fight on this front line so far for Cardolan. Hrothgar hasn't really needed to do a great deal to gain the upper hand in this fight. All he's needed to do was sort of be patient, just absorb the arrow fire from the Morannon archers, and just be safe in the knowledge that now Mordor doesn't really have an answer to your archers. As long as you keep this front line fed, for lack of a better word, shored up, make sure you have ample manpower to sort of block any Mordor advance, your archers can just go to work on the Mordor army. Meanwhile, the Trebuchet opening up once again. Again, grazing hits, maybe a little bit better in that one because it hit centre mass for the Flag Rim and some of these heavy Goblin archers as well. Linden pushing the attackers back out of the gap, with the Noldorin Guard being largely responsible for that. Obviously a really scary unit of line infantry. Still, Flag Rim arriving on the front line. The AP will actually be useful against the Noldorin. the one class of unit that armor piercing is actually useful against when you're facing off against Linden. I mean, Linden, they probably do need more reinforcements, considering another unit of Mountainer at coast over here has also arrived. And again, they're not to be taken lightly either, and just a mix of decent quality and sheer numbers is going to cause a few issues here. That looks like a rout, to be honest with you. It wasn't actually, he was just sort of getting, well, now it is. He was just trying to get closer to the front line, but now the Minhiriath men-at-arms break. Mithlon Swordmass, there's only 5 of them left, of course. One of the main factors in this fight is definitely going to be the archers and the crossbows and the like. It's quite difficult to keep track of all the kills that are happening with those as well, but I think the attackers will probably be quite pleased with how things are going, because already, for how well the defenders have done at holding their lines for the time being, the problem they're having is they're actually taking quite a lot of damage here. Their manpower is starting to dwindle. I mean, they have got a decent amount of reinforcements they can send in, but the attackers can play this game for far longer than the defenders. Now over here we can see the Horse Swords of Ulmo have finished off the Dragon Knights now. Whatever happened to the Melkor's Chosen? They're way over there. They really need to deal with the Horse Swords of Ulmo for me. Again, all it really takes is for some decent charges into stuff like the Flag Rim and the Eastron Crossbows to make the Horse Swords of Ulmo a really efficient unit in this battle. They've already dealt with the cavalry. Not really too important for the attackers' chances, it's just a lot of money down the drain. But if they can start doing damage to infantry and archers as well, that changes things somewhat. Mordor now sending some actual units in, but again, it's still just morale on infantry. I can understand why you'd be reluctant to charge in here like this. Minhiriath archers and Gwathlo trackers doing a lot of damage. You don't really have an answer to it, but for me, you're not going to accomplish much like this either, because you're not sending forward enough quality, you're not even sending forward enough quantity to really put the pipeline in danger, to try and maybe buckle the phalanx formation and give Cardolan something to think about through sheer numbers. For me, I would send forward I would send forward the Blackguard of Barad-dûr. And possibly the Nazgul as well. Just in and amongst them to try and smuggle them onto the front line. And then I'd try and bash my way through. And then if that worked, I would send forward everything all at once. It might fail, but I feel as though it would at least make the defenders panic enough that over here they would underman themselves severely, and then Rhûn and the Misty Mountains could easily waltz on in and retake the settlement. Warns of Tirn Gorthad on the front line. Again, you can see every time we come over here another unit has been committed, but it's also very depleted. I say very depleted. 66 isn't super depleted, I suppose, but I mean, Warns of Tirn Gorthad, they're a morale buffing unit, decently expensive, vulnerable to arrow and crossbow fire in spite of their armour. They're obviously going to be a real lightning rod for the attentions of the attacking skirmishers. Having said that, the attackers probably do need a few more on the front line here. The Mountainer at coast, certainly the Flag Rim have taken a lot of damage. And it's not too hard to see why when you consider all the pikes and now heavy swordsmen that are engaging them. The Goblin King's Bodyguard are also here, but they too have taken damage. It just goes to show the defenders aren't the only ones suffering a lot of casualties at the hands of ranged units here. The attackers are also doing so, but I feel as though the attackers can withstand that kind of punishment for longer than the defenders. Having said that, still a decent amount over here. Still a few units squirreled away at the back that can be used later. Mordor, their army sort of moving into view a little bit more so now, but they're still not making any genuine progress for me over on this front line. Damage being done, but yeah, Moran on infantry, they're going to break pretty soon. Again, this is the beauty of cheap pikes. The Greenway Garrison Spearmen are around the same sort of price point as the Moran on infantry, if not a little bit cheaper. It's around the same sort of price, I think. But in this sort of situation where their phalanx isn't being compromised, this is where pikes are most at home. Cheap pikes especially, and they may not do damage very quickly, cheap pikemen like the Greenway Garrison footmen, but they can be really, really efficient against players who want to take their time and filter in units like Clem. It's not necessarily the wrong thing in all situations for Clem to try and play like this, but I feel as though Cardolan will be not too concerned with how this fight is going over on that side. Over on this side, it's a bit of a different story. There are bodies littering the ground from both factions, or both sides, I should say. All factions that have fought over here. But that is something that will concern the attackers far less, as I keep saying. More reinforcements on the way over. Harland and Guard. I mean, the Gwathlo trackers have moved over here now as well, engaging in melee, pulling out their hand axes, but again, not great in melee, and also lightly armoured, so they're also going to be under real scrutiny from any of the attacking skirmishers as well. And there are the whiter at fearmongers as well, those halberds coming into view. Variag mercenaries trying to do some damage over here to the Mithlon Marines. They definitely still have ammunition, considering the fact they're still clutching a javelin. They may not be as good as they are in the hotfix, but they're still a dangerous unit, and when all is said and done, they're decent in melee as well, so definitely a nice unit for Linden to have in this sort of situation, but only if they can utilise their range damage first and foremost. And then any... lots of damage done there by the trebuchet. A unit that the attackers will be very worried to see will be the Warns Velos Tyrian, because they're a unit which is capable, of course, of dealing incredible amounts of damage very quickly. It's often difficult to assess the destruction that Rangers are doing until after they've succeeded in tearing a hole through the opposing army, not always the attacking army. Meanwhile, over here, these units of archers that are over here must have racked up an impressive kill count for themselves. That unit of Gwathlo trackers that was over here was transitioned over to the other side to be used as a meat shield on the front line as well, so that was their reward for killing plenty of orcs. They can now go into melee against some savage Easterlings. Mordor, having said that, still a decent amount of troops back here, but again, we're getting into the point where Clem will have to use some stronger units. The Orc Javelins could be sent forward, I suppose, but unsupported. I feel as though people know that Javelins should be supported when they get moved forward. I'm going to assume, anyway, that is what's going to happen. Minhiriath men-at-arms, and still the spears, and yeah, that's going to be the end. The Mordor, well, I say the end, at least one of the units of Mordor infantry is running for the hills. Breaking starting to happen. Not good for them. In come the Minhiriath spears, just to really make sure, really twist the knife over here, and Cardolan asserting their dominance over Mordor. Like I said, I feel as though it maybe would have been a little bit better if Rhûn had sent over at least some token support for Mordor. Might have emboldened Mordor to be maybe a little bit more on the front foot to try and make something happen. Reinforcements for this front line as well. Again, Minhiriath spearmen. They could get into formation, make life a little bit more difficult. I think they're just going to charge in here though. Try and get up close and personal. Maybe not the best matchup for them, considering the White Earth Fearmongers are here. They have taken damage already, and again, the White Earth Fearmongers, another one of these units to suffer this fate. Damage has been done to them at range very quickly. Crossbowmen are in melee now as well, which honestly is a sign that maybe, well, there's still quite a lot of Flagrim and Sciolrim out here for Rhûn. But the Misty Mountains have sent forward quite a lot already, and they are looking a little bit thin on the ground at this point, and yeah, more reinforcements are definitely needed on the front line if the attackers are going to keep this assault going. We shall see if they do indeed want to do that. In comes some Gamp Rim. They still have crossbow ammunition, which is fairly key, to be honest with you, because again, that's going to be such a devastating thing. Mithlon pikemen, of course, in comparison to the cheap pikes we saw on the other side, they're capable of dishing out damage much quicker with a lower man count and, you know, again, similar weakness to arrows. However, they are kind of easier to counter in that way, but in a fight like this, where they are able to get their pikes down and make it all about melee, they will be all too happy to take this fight. And of course, Rhûn are trying to sort of counteract with a phalanx unit of their own, but these are halberdiers. Pikes have got superior range. As long as they maintain their shape here, the attackers are sort of, well, the defenders I should say, are sort of bumbling right into that phalanx. They're doing damage, sure, but maybe taking a little bit more damage than they would need to. Blackback Berserkers moving in as well. Devastating unit in terms of the damage they can potentially deal. Mordor moving forward with some bit more intent now. Sauron's will have moved forward, but they've taken damage, a lot of damage, and that's mostly at the hands of the Minotaur Roman gatekeepers, you would suggest. Already they're shaken. Again, this fight over here for Mordor, like, they've continuously sent men forward without sufficient support. If they had blobbed up, I do have sympathy for Clem in this sort of situation, because if they do blob up, they put themselves at the mercy of all of the skirmishers that are over here, potentially even the rangers. I don't know where they've gone. They may still have ammunition, or they may have just gone into hiding. But Mordor can wipe all of the misfortune they've suffered in this battle so far away if they can push through with the Blackguard of Barad-dûr now. They can't afford to hang around because there are Tharbad Warhammers here. There are crossbowmen. There are still archers. In comes the trebuchet fire as well, so they really do need to push through here quickly, and I like the fact that Clem is now doing this. Decent grazing hit from the trebuchet. That shouldn't be enough to rout them, and indeed it isn't. Nazgul, in come the trolls, in come the Melkors chosen. So this is the time for Mordor. As much as they've taken things slowly up till this point, this is a move I really do approve of, because they're already struggling somewhat on the other side, the defenders. Now Mordor, even if this fails, they will have dealt a significant amount of panic at the very least to the defenders. That was a lot of damage, however, dealt, and the Blackguard are slightly struggling with that. Minhiriath archers sort of closing the door there. Noldorin Guard jumping on the Melkor's Chosen, as are the Hearthguard. The Melkor's Chosen need to keep running through the settlement and causing havoc. If they get hung up on these elite infantry units, especially the spears, they're going to suffer for it, and indeed they are suffering for it. Took quite a bit of damage on the way through there, but this is it for Mordor. Horseswords of Ulmo coming around. Without the Melkor's Chosen out on the open field now, the Horseswords of Ulmo are free to come around here. As much as I approve of this move from Clem, it does look as though it is going to backfire. It is on the units on the other side now, his fellow attackers, to try and take advantage of this, because now what he has succeeded in doing is committing a lot of the defenders over here to try and hold this position. What this means is, this can happen. They didn't have enough on this front line to hold on to it any longer, the defenders, and it means that the Misty Mountains and Rhûn can break in. I'm glad to see that they have moved in. Rhûn may be dragging their heels a little bit with the Flag Rim and Scion Rim, which will be necessary to consolidate their gains here. Melkor's Chosen have got all the way back to the Trebuchet as well. Excuse me. I don't have coronavirus, I swear. Mithlon Pikemen have caught up to the Melkor's Chosen though, but they may kill off the entire Trebuchet crew before the Pikes have a chance to kill the entirety of the Melkor's Chosen unit, which I think that would be a worthwhile trade for Mordor, to be honest with you. The Treb still has a bit of ammo. It could be a devastating tool, especially with regards to doing morale damage. I mean, the Warns of Alos Tyrion have now revealed themselves. That isn't a way up, surely. Actually, it might be. That might be a way up onto this high ground. Yeah, the defenders are surely going to be in a bit of trouble here. Like, they're still alive, but they're going to need to finish off Mordor very quickly and then put up a united front against Rhûn and the Misty Mountains. If that takes too long, they will be caught out of position and they will pay for it. And unfortunately for them, Mordor actually do have some units which will be able to maintain for quite a while over here. The Temple Executioners being one, but especially the Nazgul. The Nazgul can be a real pain in the neck. There isn't really any killing them quickly. And I think the defenders kind of see the fact they need to kill Mordor off quickly, but I think they've already left it too late. The Misty Mountains are rapidly closing in on supporting Mordor. In come the Warns of Alos Tyrion. The Noldorin Blade Masters are in here as well. They are recharging with the Horse Swords of Ulmo, and that is enough to break some of the more depleted units. But the Nazgul will fight to the bitter end. The Saurons will swing their axes as many times as they are able. In comes the support, and yeah, I think the attackers have just about managed to... And that was a big move from Mordor to do that. Mordor may very well end this battle without any units left, but that really, like, that was the thing that gave the attackers the momentum. Like, certainly Rhûn and the Misty Mountains saw what was happening. There was nowhere near enough troops. I mean, to be honest with you, Rhûn and the Misty Mountains probably could have done that sooner, even without Mordor committing a lot of resources over to here. But better late than never. Blackback Mountain Berserkers are here, tearing the Mithlon Pikemen apart. Sort of rapid role reversal here, because now the forces of evil have sort of reclaimed the settlement, and the defenders are now sort of, they've exodused out of the settlement. The Warns of Alos Tyrion still have ammo, which is probably their best chance for a victory at this point, as do the Minotaur Roman Gatekeepers. So the Rangers and the Crossbows both still have the ability to cause some real damage here. But will it be enough damage? I somehow doubt it. Will Mithlon Pikemen taking pretty much point-blank fire from Nar-Rim. Azog dies. Again, he is in a Goblin Infantry unit, so it's not too surprising to see him crumble under a charge from the Horse Swords of Ulmo. Yeah, I mean, this is the problem. The Warns of Alos Tyrion need to fire now, but they're going to be shot by archers that still have ammunition. Not great for Rangers. Nar-Rim shooting in, trying to maintain their formation, but from one side they're getting shot with flaming arrows. From the other, they're getting hacked apart by Blackback Mountain Berserkers, so the final vestige of resistance within the settlement here is going to be snuffed out. Still eager for the fight though, still steady. Says a lot about Linden's morale, generally speaking. All sorts of Ulmo trying to do damage where they can. Succeeding as well. Any charge they deal like that is going to peel away a chunk of manpower, but I'm not sure whether they're going to be able to deal enough now. I mean, Rhûn are the primary antagonists here, because the Misty Mountains and Mordor are very depleted at this point in time. But Rhûn still have a decent core of Flagrim and Scionrim left, which I think is going to be insurmountable here for the defenders. Warns Velos Tyrion now in melee. Heavy Goblin crossbows firing into the sides of this resistance. Never what you want to be seeing. Heavy Goblin archers, I mean, they're probably not going to last very long in melee. Pushing in with the Flagrim. Wards Velos Tyrion, defeat seems certain. Yeah, and that's a big part of why a depleted unit of E-Strong crossbows, but pretty much every unit is depleted at this point, other than a couple of choice Look units from Rhûn. Aside from that, yeah, it really is Rhûn that's mostly left. There's a few depleted units from the Misty Mountains that are still visible. I imagine the Nazgûl are still alive in here somewhere as well. Yeah, they are. There's 8 of them. 2 of them died at some point, but they were part of that big push, so they actually weren't in melee for that greater length of time, to be honest with you. I'm impressed with how much of a fight the Mythlon pikemen have put up over here, though. You'd expect against a unit like the Blackbacks their morale would collapse, especially considering they were getting shot in the back by the Nar Rim. But decent resolve here from the elves, perhaps to be expected. And maybe if those flaming effects from the Nar Rim weren't just cosmetic, they would have routed a while back. There are the drummers, finishing off the resistance here. That's going to be the end of Linden. Linden defeated. And Hrothgar's Cardolan army, the only ones that are left. The final stand of the Minotaur Roman gatekeepers up on this hill. Almost like the ultimate bragging rights here for the attackers. They've actually managed to force the defenders out of the settlement and reclaim it for themselves while the battle is still going on, rather than just the implication of that happening after the battle has ended. In comes some range support. The armour will absorb a decent amount of this, but of course it's only a matter of time here. It's just a matter of how many they can take with them before they fall. Yeah, I mean, Rhûn, pretty much 4 decent sized units for Rhûn, and then a smattering of other units as well are what remains for the attackers after this fight. More fiery arrows coming in. Let's see here. Yeah, interesting map, and again, this is one of those maps in 0.97 that's quite multifaceted. You can see this play out in a number of ways. It'll be interesting to see what the other map I got sent is like. Obviously, it'll be a little while before I do that one. But there's plenty of sections in this map we never really got to see. We have seen this map once before, and it was sort of a more centrally focused fight around here. There are these lakes, of course, back here, the encampment over the far side. But today we saw much more of a siege battle centered around this settlement in this little valley. The armour definitely doing the thing. I mean, the Cave Troll drummers will actually fall pretty quickly against a unit like the Minotaur Roman gatekeepers, you'd expect. I mean, it's an extreme amount of pressure that the gatekeepers are being put under. And maybe the trolls can be... I mean, it would maybe help if the unit of infantry that wasn't fighting them at the front wasn't the goblin infantry, because they're not really doing much damage. I mean, there they go. Oh, is there another unit? Is it the Horse Lords of Ulmo? It might be. No, because Linden admitted defeat, didn't they? What else have they got in here, then? Those Minotaur Roman gatekeepers are broken and fighting to the death. There's still something, apparently. There's still a green star over here. Oh, there he is. It's the general of all things. He's there just sort of hoping the orcs don't see him, I guess. Taking cover behind this dirt verge. I mean, his shield's pointing the wrong way. This is going to be the end of him. He will at least die with his men, even if he died, maybe hoping that he would be able to avoid that fate, but unfortunately, luck is certainly not with him this day. And unfortunately for him as well, this time instead of Goblin Infantry leading the way, it's going to be the Blackbacks. A final charge down the hill before he inevitably gets torn apart. A grisly fate indeed. Fairly savage weapon that the Blackbacks use. Yeah, reasonably close I would say, considering the size of the armies relative to one another. And it is only Rhûn that have a sort of fairly decent chunk of their forces remaining. Of course, Linden with a small army. Rhûn with a small army as well, actually, interestingly enough. For a defender, Cardolan's army was maybe a little larger. But they also got more kills. Rhûn with a very low amount of kills, actually. And a large part of that is the fact they had a lot in reserve. And most of the heavy lifting was certainly done by Mordor and the Misty Mountains. And I'm glad to see that Mordor did approach the battle in that way. They did, in the end, effectively lay down their lives for the cause, and the Misty Mountains, and then ultimately Rhûn, of course, were able to make it count. But I think no one really played too poorly. I think maybe the Runic player learnt a valuable lesson about you got to learn what type of cavalry does what, because those Horse Swords of Ulmo really tore those cataphracts apart. And you really, again, if he didn't do that, then maybe Rhûn would have had the ability to use his cavalry late on as well, which would of course would have made the margin of victory even more significant. But decent defensive work, I would say, by the defenders. It's always difficult when you're in a 2v3, and again, there isn't really anywhere to retreat, so as soon as the first defences are breached, it's kind of difficult to stop the sort of spiralling effect that happens in this sort of battle, which is of course the downside to having sort of a relatively small settlement like this. While you are able to concentrate your defence on just maybe 1 or 2 choke points across the whole battle, if something goes wrong on one of those 2 choke points, you're in real trouble. And obviously Mordor pushed forward, they didn't have enough manpower to really hold both sides. And also, when you're dealing with this kind of battle, the attackers did use their ranged units very well. Like, there wasn't a huge amount of quality in their ranged units, like the heavy goblin crossbows and maybe the Gnar Rim were the highest quality ranged units they had, but just through sheer volume they were able to deal a lot of atricious damage, which you don't really get a good handle on throughout the entire battle. But Linden and Cardolan clearly struggled with that, because they did have decent armies, and over the course of the battle, through means that we weren't maybe seeing clearly, they were losing manpower pretty rapidly. And obviously that's a real problem for Linden with a smaller army and of course light armour. But still, decent play considering all of that stuff from Hrothgar and My Dude, as well as all the attackers Glatati, Hunter and Clem. Let's see what did the damage for Cardolan. Warns of Amon-Sul, they did okay considering late on. They're not really designed to be damage dealers, they're just designed to be a nice reliable core to the army. Tharbad Warhammers, when they were committed, that was actually when Mordor really came forward with the hammer, which is maybe why they didn't get as many kills as they could have. Dunedain Captains did slightly better, obviously maybe a little bit more of a smooth ride for them. Yeah, Minhiriad Spears, Mercenary Guildsmen, the units that were committed early against some of the lower tier units clearly did better here for Cardolan. And yeah, down here you can see Gwathlo Trackers, Minotaur, Roman Gatekeepers and the Trebuchet actually breaking 300 kills. So in spite of the fact a lot of the hits were actually grazing hits, they did add up in the end, and a good choice. I think in a lot of sieges, a lot of the Númenórean factions will really benefit from a Trebuchet. And the Gwathlo Trackers, of course, they were in such a perfect position. How could they not rack up an impressive kill count? And the Gatekeepers always will, to be fair. If you can keep them firing for an elongated period of time like here, they will. But it was only 1 unit of crossbows this time instead of the 3 that Cardolan can normally bring, and maybe that would have made a difference. Again, I'm not condoning the overuse of crossbows by any means, but the sharpshooters could have made a big difference to their fate in this battle. But we shall never know here. We'll never know now. Hindsight is 2020. As for the next battle, like I said, I do intend to do Minas Tirith when I next have the chance. There may be a battle in between this one and the Minas Tirith battle if I don't have the opportunity to record before then, but I think I should. I think Minas Tirith will probably be the next one, to be honest with you. But we shall see. Hotfix, obviously, hotfix news. We'll see when that happens. I think that's likely to be sooner rather than later. It could be within the week that I sort of release a little thing for the hotfix, just sort of detailing. Well, I say detailing, just lightly going over what to expect from the hotfix. Like, it's not a full-on patch like 0.97 was, but there are some changes, certainly, well, some visual changes. Obviously some stability and sort of performance and mechanical improvements, and also sort of the reintroduction of the maps without having to manually fudge it like I will for Minas Tirith here. But obviously the Númenórean settlements will be back, and maybe finally I'll finally be able to show Minas Ithil, because that map has existed for quite some time at this point. I think over 2 years, maybe 2.5 years, and I still haven't. 2.5 years might be pushing it a little bit actually. But it's definitely existed for over 1.5 years, and I still haven't been able to show it, which is incredibly frustrating. But maybe now, with the hotfix on the horizon, we'll finally be able to see it. But yeah, regardless, hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.